New. I'm Kendall Klaus. I'm the chair of the committee this year, and I have Miguel Walker and Ashley Griswold with me. They are co-pilots in leading this group. Today we are going to be talking about the Climate Equity Plan. And every month this year is going to be focused on a different section of the Climate Equity Plan in an effort to help the city with implementation. And tonight we are focusing on preservation and rehabilitation specifically. And we have two special guests with us, Shaun Auckland, who is a sustainability coordinator at the Travis County Transportation and Natural Resources, as well as she is serving as the Texas Regional Council Chair for USGBC. And then we have Daniel Kietzer. He is a program designer, facilitator, and director of operations with the U.S. Business Council for Sustainable Development. So I will go ahead and hand it off to Shaun to start. And if you all have any questions throughout the presentation, please put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to them in between Shaun and Daniel, and then at the end. So go ahead, Shaun.
Okay, thank you. All right. Can you all see the first slide? My screen?
Yes.
Great. Usually I just ask for a thumbs up. That helps too. Don't always look at the screen. So first of all, I just want to say thanks for this opportunity. I'm pretty excited about it, to talk to professionals who, you spend every day with planning and being thoughtful, and hopefully incorporating sustainability in mind. So again, Shaun Auckland with Travis County. I've been with Travis County for about 9 years, and it encompasses integrating policies for environmentally preferable purchasing, working on integrating sustainable concepts into a jail system, as well as certain passions. I'm a mom of a 10-year-old, and so you may hear her in the background sometime. And there's also just I love building and reuse and cycling. So those are some of my really strong passions, and so cycling has a very strong integration with planning. So a little bit about Travis County. There we go. So Travis County, as an agency, if you're not familiar with it, it provides a variety of services, and this includes voter registration, as well as voting systems, road maintenance, planning, transportation planning, public safety, the court system, a medical examiner office, as well as a park system with 9,666 acres of land. So a lot of different diversity and operations. We also, in our portfolio of buildings of 47, we have 2 silver LEED certified buildings, as well as 2 gold LEED certified buildings. So today, with that invitation, I was like, well, what am I going to be discussing and what's important to me? So building design and sense of place and culture was very important whenever I participated in the sustainable building group with the City of Austin climate plan. And so also learning about using an equity matrix when preserving and rehabilitating buildings, as well as incorporating embodied carbon as a benefit to preserve existing buildings. So this image right here that you see was taken some time ago. It was in 2008. And it's an image that was taken from the Observer article titled, "I lived in East Austin for 60 years and I don't recognize it anymore." With this photo, the direction it was taken from is west of I-35, looking down at, you can see in front of you is East 4th Street and 5th Street. And so what we're actually looking at is where Saltillo Plaza exists. And so we know today in 2020, it's a greatly different and very well-planned area that also looks substantially different than it did in 2008. So why is sense of place? What is it? It's in architecture, it's about context as well as identity of unique characteristics of buildings for space or meaning of an occupant. And I'm sure that you all are very familiar with that, but my background's in geography, and sense of place always resonates with everything I do. And so it's also about perceptions of a person's environment and their experience. And so again, why is it important? So understanding a place is fundamental to the concept of livability, including transportation aspects of livability. You know, people live in places and we move in between places and depend on movement and also our experiences there. So the individual characteristics of place are vital in determining our quality of life. See if I can just, perfect. I just hit the arrow button. So, you know, we all know this information, but I think it's important to reiterate when we talk about rehabilitation and preservation. So changing neighborhoods. Here I have two great examples about the change of neighborhoods. The neighborhoods that see the greatest percentage of homes demolished are largely in East Austin. The Chestnut Census Tract was the most extreme example, and where the data indicated that was nearly 20% of the homes have been demolished since the year 2000. And some of this data is a little bit antiquated, as you know, so it's probably been a stronger increase. Moving further east in MLK, the trend suggests that demolitions having spiked are presumably aligned with rising land values. We know this. Of course, East Austin's demolition rates may be the highest, but similar patterns can be found across the city of Austin. And then also with a Bolden neighborhood. And you can see that as well through this, this map right here. And this data you can take and create on your own through the city of Austin. Census, they have a great layer that you can pull this information from. So they had nearly 300 demolitions since year 200. And the demolitions rise as you move further north or south or from the city center. And so, you know, it may not surprise you that demolition rates continue to rise throughout Austin. And the data illustrates the dramatic extent to which neighborhoods are being transformed. And then also here we have builders scrambling to keep up with demand. And the housing construction in Central Texas have reached record levels here in 2020, even during a pandemic. And the median sales price of those new homes have hit all-time highs, which we all know as well. So the industry experts say that the continuous themes are high demand, low supply, and to many dismay of buyers, rising prices, right? So I find this is important because now there is a divergence of what new architecture and old are side by side. And this photo personifies the changing sense of place for two types of architecture. You know, this includes landscape and the height of buildings. And these differences all affect the clashing of new versus old. When discussing sustainable buildings, we should also just acknowledge, you know, we're looking at these two buildings of the new and the old and start asking ourselves, what is the true carbon impact? And we'll have a higher level discussion of this later on in the presentation. I also want to mention commercial buildings. We've seen a huge rise as well as high rises in Austin. And so, you know, here's a great example. This commercial building was repurposed warehouse and turned into a LEED certified office building. And this building here, you know, has a good sense of place, but the question is also still like, what is this building's impact to its surroundings and that community and neighborhood? And with that, asking those questions, and Phoebe, you can always pipe in because I look to you as the kind of expert in the room. But we're going to talk a bit about equity. And I'm not going to go through all these bullet points because we have a short period of time, but why is equity important? And I also want to add that these next 4 slides were extracted from the City of Austin's Sustainable Equity Tool Process presentation. And so if you want to see more, please reach out to Phoebe, and she has some great information in here. So, the importance of evaluating strategies developed when preserving and rehabilitating buildings is using an equity matrix. And, these are great reasons why equity is important. Local necessity, it's part of the national conversation. Every technology policy action requires people to implement and act. And I think that what's really interesting and important to be mindful of is that if we don't include everyone in the community in our solutions, we'll never reach the scale that's necessary to solve problems. And we got to proactively address equity, otherwise we're perpetuating injustice. So coming to this, and this is a really great visual about kind of giving an idea with climate change and racial equity and how they're intertwined. So while we're transitioning away from fossil fuels, we must also build strong, resilient infrastructure and support natural systems, right? And advance social and racial justice, improve community livability and public health. These are all knowns. And then we also need to create high quality jobs for all. And then shift patterns of urban development, transportation, buildings, consumptions towards large, low carbon options and strengthen the local economy. So this right here has a great demonstration of with climate change and the importance of it, but then also thinking about racial equity. So you have to have that thoughtful process. So because they all intertwine and meet in the middle for health, affordability, accessibility, transition, cultural preservation, community capacity, and accountability. Because you don't always know whenever you're putting into and pushing forward some climate change policy, if there's going to be an economic outcome that's disproportionate. So here, we all know that whenever you're planning or you're part of an architectural team, that you kind of have that what in the climate plan they had advisory groups and had these questions. And I thought this was really interesting to kind of think about, as well as whenever you're working with your team, especially with teams when they're moving forward with a LEED certification, is ask these questions. What is the history of this space? What are the inequities? What are the maps saying and data and stories of this region? And then research the history of racial injustice for that space, relevant to any kind of strategies that you may be having. And then also, what does the data tell us? Is it disintegration by race, income, and location? And then, also just kind of look at what's the proposed goal for your space. Does it include climate and equity components? Is that important to your clients or what organization you're working with? You got to kind of understand the historical context when you're looking at these buildings and opportunities. And then develop strategies. How would we achieve this goal with history and disaggregated data in mind? And who will own this strategy? Who needs to participate? And what are the costs and benefits? And if the strategy is completely successful, does it achieve its goal? I think that these are definitely applicable whenever you're thinking about your planning and your design process, as well as analyze strategies for the equity tool. Does it meet our values? Go through this matrix, and next slide will be some examples of what this matrix looks like. And then implementation, how do we ensure accountability? And then how do we communicate the results? So how do you communicate the results of being thoughtful about equity to your clients, and also demonstrate that to the community around them? And then also evaluate accountability and just kind of report back information. So here's an example of one of the matrices with the equity matrix. And the idea is to, whenever we were going through the sustainable building process, this is one of the matrices we looked at, but I thought this was applicable for this presentation. And we were told to use this tool to ensure that no strategies have a negative impact, and to use the tool to revise strategies until there was a neutral or beneficial impact across the board. So here are some questions of, does the proposed action acknowledge, respect, honor the culture, historic assets, and traditions of low income and communities of color? Does the proposed action improve social cohesion, engagement and connection with and to the community among low income communities and communities of color? And that does the proposed actions decision-making processes go beyond dollars and cents to address shared values and cultural differences in order to support implementation? And then kind of giving responses. A great example would be, there was Austin Independent School District. They had the Go Valley Elementary School, which is down the road from me. They recently remodeled that, where they were demolishing the old building, which is very much a part of the community, including community murals. And what they did was a very thoughtful process on engaging the community, saying this is the change. They also took some of the murals and kept it, saved it, and then put it inside the building so that the community still felt like this changed, but we're still keeping on that historic importance. So now I'm going to shift to talking about an embodied carbon and the importance of having that. And so just to give a caveat is like these two slides were adapted from telling the full carbon story of your design. And we're going to shift from equity to learning about the economics of embodied carbon of a building. And the importance of this shift is that there's these connections, right? We're talking about climate change, we're talking about equity, and then you also need to talk about the embodied carbon of old and preserving older buildings. So here we talk about embodied carbon, materials, extraction, manufacture, transportation, repair, maintenance, and disposal. So you have a 1936 craftsman style home. Yes, it has a leaky system, right? You have the boards in the bottom of the house that you still have air gaps, but everything already has its embodied carbon. And it's new. We're not having to go through and dispose of anything in this house except for maybe having to replace a commode or two. And then we go to operational carbon, which we all know about, with energy, water, vegetation, transit, waste, and food. And then that's the total carbon footprint. Well, why is this topic important? Buildings account for 39% of the CO2. 28% is operations and 11% is in construction. Embodied carbon is already locked in. So my 1936 home, all my embodied carbon is locked in here. So all global new construction is by 2050, 49% of CO2 will be from embodied carbon. And so conversation is now shifting. Should we tear down this home? Can we? Or how do we, and what should we do? I think that's pretty important. And I was pretty passionate, I guess, as Phoebe knows, about having those conversations about what is the importance, and we do need to preserve our cultural awareness. Yeah. So I wanted to have a stronger takeaway, and that is that as the conversation shifts, it's aligned with the same shift in incorporation of using equity and being thoughtful, because they're combined. Doing preservation of homes and historic buildings are directly aligned with being thoughtful about planning and design. As we move forward with more companies and organizations with climate goals, it gives architects the opportunity to promote the use of existing buildings, embodied carbon as a benefit. And there's some great resources out there that you can use to demonstrate the embodied carbon of that building versus doing new construction. And you can reach out to me and I'll be happy to share it with you. And also the preservation and rehabilitation of buildings has so many benefits culturally and for climate change goals. My daughter, I was telling her I was giving this presentation today, and she told me, she's like, Mom, you should start off saying these buildings all have stories, and we need to keep them for generations for those stories to be told. And this is from a 10-year-old. So I'm pretty proud of her. So I ask, here's my action. I ask for you architects, planners, and designers to use your influence with your clients. Ask them if they have sustainability goals or a climate action plan. I mean, Tesla's here. So an Oracle, like, what are their goals? And they're going to have a great impact. And where is their project located? Are they located in Del Valley? Or how is that going to be? Is there a negative impact or cultural relevance? Or what's the history to the community? And can you use existing buildings to preserve the cultural landscape? So in summary, I have here is a photo of a great example of in San Antonio, where they took existing buildings and they created this space for the community. Here is the Pearl District, right? And look at the diversity. So, the sense of place is a driver that's vital in determining quality of life. Equity is not just a conversation, but a process to be incorporated into the planning and building for a sustainable building. And the benefits of embodied carbon and use of an equity matrix are strategic processes and rehabilitating buildings and cultural landscape preservation. So I want to say thank you. These are very high, you can go very in depth on these topics, and I really appreciate the opportunity just to give you a taste and an introduction, and you're welcome to reach out to me as well as Phoebe, but there's so many resources to really demonstrate these benefits. And I look forward to any questions after we listen to Daniel Kaiser's presentation. I'm going to stop sharing.
Thank you, Shaun. Before we move on to Daniel's, are there any initial questions that you had for Shaun? Feel free to unmute yourself.
And you're right, the brewery is worth a visit.
I see someone did ask what GARE stands for, and I see Phoebe answered, but maybe you can explain it a little bit.
Yeah, I'm going to leave that to Phoebe.
Phoebe?
I meant to give the acronym. Yeah.
Yeah, of course. So I was going to, put a bunch of links in the chat, so I'll go ahead and just preface some of what I was about to put in. But yeah, so GARE is the Government Alliance on Race and Equity. It was actually through the leadership of the City Equity Office that we saw how they developed an equity tool for different departments. And one of the resources they listed was this racial equity toolkit that I can put in the chat. It's a PDF, but they have a 6-step process that's about, so what policy program practice are you doing? What are the desired outcomes? And then again, looking at the data, history, community engagement, making it an iterative process. And so I'll link that. On the equity tool, we do have a webinar that we recorded, as well as some slides of all of the different, as Shaun showed the cultural preservation, but there's others. And then we developed some examples. My note is just that was at the beginning of the process. So the examples aren't necessarily the strategies that ended up in the plan, but it's still helpful as far as like taking that tool and looking what an evaluation using race and equity to examine these strategies and think about, issues of displacement and culture and all of those aspects. And then the last thing that I was going to link is this guide that I just found out about. You all may know about it, but San Antonio actually has a sustainability guide for older structures that was released, I guess, around this time last year. So in case you haven't seen it, it's pretty relevant for this topic. So yeah, those are all my comments.
Thanks, Phoebe.
Yeah, the one thing I would say, and this, I sort of dropped a couple of comments about this in the chat. There's a lot of complexity involved in updating the conditioning and the enclosure of historic structures, and a lot of careful consideration that needs to go into the energy profile of whatever redesign is happening, as well as the potential health outcomes. So it's worth bringing a consultant on board to your projects if you're designing, to make sure that that is well thought through and that you're not creating a recipe for something to go wrong, because building physics pre 2009 and now are quite different paradigms. The way that we do things is quite different than it was 100 years ago. So assemble a good team who has a good reputation for that kind of work, and I think you'll be in good shape. But just shooting from the hip is not really appropriate in that scenario, or else you'll eventually have to tear down the building anyway because it's going to be infested with mold and all kinds of other issues. So there you go.
And that's a really good point, Michael. But there was also some really great information coming out of the Texas Historic and Preservation. And what they're also doing is education for people to understand what they can do in rehabilitation. And that even includes encouragement on how to replace their own windows, not necessarily with new ones, but using the historic windows and having those kind of replacements. So I think that, you have a very valid point. You shouldn't really shoot from the hip when you're looking at those things. But I also have these conversations with people because I wanted to use a picture of across the street from me, where you have this a situation where you have an older home and a brand new home. And I have conversations where people say, oh, well, this newer home is better with embodied carbon and or better for the environment and density. And I said, well, they just use, you have two new homes. That's two new homes with a new double the carbon impact and all new. So it's an interesting conversation to be had.
I might say one more thing, Shaun. I think what stuck out to me was actually the comment that your daughter made about each building having a story. I think that is really what we were trying to talk about today in terms of the importance of preserving culture, and in addition to structures themselves related to embodied carbon. But you showed the picture of the east side of Austin, and it looks nothing like that now. And a lot of the culture that existed there has been erased. So I think that's just also a very important thing, and why you all talked about the equity tools. And thanks, Phoebe, for putting all of those resources in the chat.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, thanks, Shaun. So now we're going to switch over to Daniel Kietzer. So Daniel, if you want to share your screen, and I'll let you introduce yourself.
Yeah, good. Let's see. All right, it should be up now. So yeah, I'm Daniel Kietzer. I work with the U.S. Business Council for Sustainable Development. Really long acronym. That's a pain to say all day, every day, but we get through it. But yeah, I've been with the USBCSD for a little over 10 years now, working on all things sustainability. I'll tell you a little more about what we do as an organization here in a second. I've lived in Austin for quite a while now, going on around 17 years. I live in a very old house with a lot of embodied carbon in Hyde Park. And then I went to school here as well. But my day-to-day is filled with a lot of sustainability program design work. I do a lot of facilitation work and stakeholder engagement, mostly with larger kind of corporate clients and members of our organization. And then I have a little bit of a specialty in reuse and recycling market development, which is what I'll be talking about a little bit here in the buildings context. Some personal things. I'm a backyard chicken enthusiast. I've got a few that are going into the coop out back right now. And then there's 8 new chicks right behind me. So if you can hear them chirping, sorry about that. They're just getting to that stage where they're starting to get noisy. And then all my contact information is here as well if you want to stay in touch with me too. But a little about our organization. So the Business Council is kind of getting up there in age, which is always a good thing for nonprofits in the environmental space to kind of have that staying power. But we were founded a little over 25 years ago, I guess, here in Austin, actually. And work primarily with business and industry on a pretty wide variety of sustainability topics. Everything is very member-led in our organization, so we try to kind of harness ideas for projects and really hear from business what their issues are, as they're going down the path of implementing a climate plan or things along those lines. We try to listen to them and then bring them together in collaborative projects that get them working with one another in ways that they don't typically work together. So we've got a couple of kind of major focus areas today. Circular economy is a really big one for our organization and a space we've been working in for quite a while. Carbon, of course, I don't think you can be a environmental organization or a sustainability organization without working on carbon. Our play in that is a little more on the industrial side and kind of on industrial operations, but it does touch the building space as well a little bit. We've done some energy work in the past, again, mostly in the building space. Some water work, more on the kind of watershed side of things. And then we've always kind of have our ears open for new feelers of projects. This is kind of what it looks like today when you start putting some names around it. But the one I'll be talking about mostly today is our work on the materials marketplace and kind of how that relates to the space here too. So just so we're all going into this on the same page, when we talk about circular economy, just to kind of define that a little bit for us, we're looking at circular models, not linear models where there's a take, make, and dispose kind of mindset. We're looking at opportunities for reuse. We're looking at opportunities for recycling. We're looking at opportunities on the organic side of it for composting and getting nutrients back into our systems, and eventually kind of decoupling our economic activity from using finite resources that we're pulling out of the ground. That looks kind of like this if you're more of a visual learner. So you can see on the right side of this, the blue bubbles. You're looking more at the kind of finite material side of it. Left side of this, you're looking more at the renewable side of things. But obviously a lot of different loops here. But as you can see, everything kind of circles back into itself and eventually gets back into the system where it started. So if we dig into a couple of these principles and how this looks when we're looking at the built environment, it's kind of 6 very high level bullet points here of what we like to promote and what we like to see happening. Design for deconstruction, obviously a huge one. So we're taking things apart in ways that let us use those materials in a new life. Designing for adaptive reuse, like that HEB project that Shaun mentioned, where we're giving new life to old buildings, obviously a super important thing, both in terms of cultural impact and the embodied carbon piece, which I really, really like to talk about. Repurposing old structures, kind of in that same vein. Reuse and design and incorporating reused materials in designs. Using recycled content in building materials, a great way to also talk about embodied carbon if you can trace that value chain back. And then finally, kind of the lowest tier of use of materials, construction and demolition, debris recycling, which is a really complicated and really interesting space with a lot of challenges, but also a lot of opportunities. So to talk a little about kind of what we do here at the Business Council, so this is our materials marketplace program. You can see with all the things that we don't do removed here, it simplifies things a little bit, but we're really trying to promote and enable reuse, refurbishing, recycling, and more on the kind of finite material side of things, although we do dabble a little bit in composting and some of those other operations. But we run a network. We're kind of a bootleg software company at the same time as a nonprofit. But we have a platform and a network of quite a few businesses now that stretches across North America, working on reuse and recycling opportunities. Our focus is mostly on the manufacturing side of things. So we're looking at weird byproducts and industrial outputs coming from manufacturing processes and trying to get that matched up and mated back in with another manufacturing process. That takes us into working with a lot of recycling companies to work with outputs from their process, getting that back into use with manufacturers. And then we also dabble in the entrepreneurship space as well. So helping folks launch new businesses and kind of bring new ideas to market that are working with waste materials. And that's a really, really exciting space to be in right now too. But we see a lot of barriers with making this all work and getting these materials back into use. A lot of cases there's challenges around material availability, quality specifications. But there's some really interesting opportunities and some things that companies are working on now to design systems that get their own materials back to them for reuse and recycling. A lot of that kind of requires this process innovation and some vertical integration. But we're seeing a lot of cool work being done on that right now. And then, of course, the economics have to make sense. There has to be supportive regulatory enablers that work in this space. So it touches a lot of different areas, but I think we're slowly starting to see this whole kind of system come together. I won't stay on this slide too long. We do get to work with a lot of really cool folks, including the city of Austin and Shaun at Travis County. And then across the US, we also have a handful of other kind of state and local government partners as well. But we're in the business of moving materials and keeping materials out of landfill. This is a little bit on our impact and kind of what we've been able to facilitate to date. We move a lot of glass and ceramics, and it's a really cool story I'll talk about here in a second. We do a lot of kind of weird chemicals and manufacturing kind of byproducts and excess stock. We work a lot with furniture and fixtures and equipment coming out of buildings, coming out of offices. And then after that, it's a kind of a grab bag of different materials, but all stuff that you wouldn't typically see in a recycling impact report. We get a lot of weird things, and we kind of specialize in finding homes for the weird stuff. But going back to that glass transaction. So this one, I really like this because it demonstrates a lot of the principles that we're talking about in terms of building materials. So this is a ceramic tile manufacturer. They're based in Tennessee. They're very enthusiastic about getting recycled content into their final product. And they working with ceramics, you're working with sand, which is kind of glass in its final form or starting form, however you want to look at it. And we've been working with a handful of these companies, this one being one, to get recycled glass into their products. This company here identified, and we facilitated a connection to an electronics recycler that processes old CRT monitors. That glass is really challenging to work with for a lot of recycling companies, but works perfectly to put into ceramic tiles. And so we made that connection. They're keeping a staggering amount of glass out of landfill and kind of putting into a higher and better use product. And then from an embodied carbon perspective, these tiles are going to, they have a very long lifespan when they ultimately end up in a building. So when we're talking about locking up carbon and embodied carbon, this is a really, really good story from that perspective as well. And they also have a program for recycling materials at the end of life too. So taking some of that old tile back when it does come out of the building and being able to put that back into new tile. This one's kind of unique, and you all that are in the design space will probably know much more about this than me, but all of the coloring and design the aesthetic design for their tiles is printed on by like a giant industrial inkjet printer. And so the underlying color of that tile doesn't matter quite as much compared to other processes. So that's why this company in particular is able to use a lot more recycled content in their product. They make some really cool looking designs too. But I've been a big fan of this company and what they're doing. And like I said, it's really neat to see that come together in a product that's using a whole lot of recycled content. We do a lot of work in the plastic space. This is here on the screen, a really great example of, probably the best and certainly the biggest end market for film plastic recycling. So when you take your plastic bags to the grocery store and put them in those receptacles at a grocery store, they're probably going to Trex and they're probably getting made into this plastic composite decking. And it's a great product, super durable, lasts a really long time, but I really like it because of what it does for recycling end markets. And this company, because they exist and because they're making this product, is really giving a home for plastics that probably wouldn't otherwise have a place to go. We also work with a company that designs curbside carts for your recycling bins or your trash bins. This company in particular has done some really great work to get recycled plastic into those carts. The story here with waste management, if you know that company, they really like the color green, and they've for their entire life have spec'd green bins, but this is the first time in 30 years that they've changed the color. And because they changed the color, that allowed them to put more recycled content into the cart, which is super cool and a really cool story. So we're starting to see that, as customers demand more recycled content, that's starting to shift how those markets work. We dabble in construction and demolition materials, and we dabble because it's a really hard space to work in. We've had limited success with very small scale transactions. Somebody wants to build a shed on their property. That's the picture that you see here. But it's a really challenging space to work in, and I'll talk about some of the challenges there here in a second. We get to work with some weird things too, like oyster shells coming out of quality seafood, makes a really good road base, which is a neat thing to see. So there's a lot of opportunities out there if you put a little work into it and have motivated businesses that want to see better things done here. But yeah, so zooming in on construction and demolition and why it's kind of a challenge, we are seeing more and more kind of regulatory pressure and incentives and light encouragement, pushing project managers and contractors to recycle more construction and demolition waste. Up here is the city of Austin's relatively new C&D ordinance, which requires diversion of construction and demolition material for a decent number of projects. So over 5,000 square feet or any commercial or multifamily demolition project is affected by this ordinance. And the implementation of that is kind of where things get challenging. And not just here in Austin, but we see this in every other city and every other area that we're working in as well. And there, here, kind of from our perspective, some of the challenges that we see working in this space. So there's a lot of gap in terms of end markets for construction and demolition material, especially if it's going through a demolition process where the output of that process isn't necessarily in a reusable state or the highest quality state. And so finding those end markets for that material that are valuable enough to encourage investment in equipment that's going to do that processing is really, really challenging. If you want to look at a really good example of that, Recon are, I think, our only city certified mixed C&D processor in Austin, is doing some really cool work in terms of investing in new technology and kind of bringing some new things to market. But it's still a very, very challenging place. In terms of deconstruction, yeah, I think again we see low demand for products that are coming out of that process. Yeah, and the kind of sales channels for selling those materials are high cost. You know, where you're talking about needing to store materials or having a retail space, and marketing that and selling that. You know, but as we all know, deconstruction comes with a lot of really great stacked benefits in terms of potential for job creation, tax benefits, environmental impact. I think there's sometimes a little bit of a data gap there, but that kind of gets into the next stage of the building and design process where, you know, we see a little bit of a gap in terms of not getting data on materials into the right specifications where that can be easily integrated into building plans. Yeah, there's a lot of work that I think still needs to be done in that space, at least from what we see. But there are some kind of glimmers of hope out there. Two quick examples in the bullet points here. We've worked with Dr. Ali at Texas A&M for a number of years now. He's written a couple of really cool papers about getting more reused content, recycled content into buildings. So check out some of the stuff that he's put out there. Obviously, the Center for Maximum Potential Building Systems is a great resource and a great technical resource for getting materials back into buildings in that process. But I think there's still a long ways to go kind of in that space. And then, you know, identifying other sources of reusable material. This is a program that we did with Texas A&M and General Motors, another company that we work with, to get some of their byproduct into buildings, which was a really, really fun project to work on with them. And I think the winner of this competition actually did end up building with this material coming out of GM. It's the kind of stamping of the windows and other pieces of the car body as it comes out of there. And I think they did like a green wall made out of that stuff. That's up at the GM Tech Center here in Austin as well. If y'all want to look into that a little further. But I think there's a lot of, again, if we can get good data, if we can make the right connections, I think there's a lot of opportunity to bring some of these materials into the design process as we go along. And then I won't, you know, dwell too much on this, but there is an obvious measurable carbon impact for doing these activities. And anytime we can reuse material or use material that has a high percentage of recycled content, we are creating a carbon impact, and it is measurable. And it is something that we can report back to clients and to the folks that are kind of driving this along from, you know, with their checkbooks. So, you know, that's definitely an important part of this to kind of keep our fingers on as we continue to push this forward. So yes, that's a little bit about the work that we're doing. Some contact information here if you want to follow up with me or get in touch, but I'm happy to answer any and all questions.
Thanks, Daniel. Could hear your chicks a little bit, but
Nice.
does anyone have any questions? You can unmute yourself.
I have one, Kendall.
Go ahead.
Daniel, so there's probably a good amount of aluminum steel in landfills. Have there been any like thoughts of like mining landfills for resources?
Yeah, it's a topic that's definitely out there. I think, you know, from what we've seen, there's enough material coming in still, and it's easier to capture material coming in. That's not an area that folks are putting a lot of investment into. But I think, you know, long term, we will definitely start to see some of that activity happening. Right now, the only kind of mining of landfills that folks are doing is methane capture from landfills, kind of in that renewable natural gas context. But that's all we really see at scale, at least.
All right, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
How are you guys, how are you thinking about and relating to spray foam? It's one of those that seems like it doesn't have kind of net. Oh, did I get muted or am I still on? Okay, I'm still on.
Yeah.
It seems like one of those that it's not easily recyclable or reusable in most cases. Actually, in any case that I can think of. I'm just curious about how you guys think about it, relate to it, work with it.
Yeah, I've never seen examples of that being reused, obviously, or recycled either. Foams are a really tough thing to work with in general. And and whether you're talking about spray foam in a building or styrofoam packaging, it's a really, really difficult one to capture. Mostly just because the logistics are not easy to work with. It's hard to transport. It's really lightweight, et cetera, et cetera. So I think there's a slow shift to more natural materials as a replacement there. Like if you're talking about packaging, foam packaging, the like mushroom alternatives and some of the other kind of biomaterials that are starting to come to market, and I think in the buildings context, it would be neat to see some applications that went in that direction instead. But yeah,
I'm thinking mostly about like spray foam and building applications. It's become sort of a catch-all, at least in the residential side of the industry, here locally anyway, and I've seen it across the country as well. And I know that like it's a high embodied carbon material, there's no way around it, and it's also got just a whole host of other ethical issues with regard to labor sources and exposure to carcinogenic materials. But there are some alternatives that have made themselves known the last few years. Like one that comes to mind is Havelock sheep's wool being used as insulation. It's essentially a diverted waste, right? It comes from herds of sheep, and that wool would be, it's basically like the stuff that's discarded and not used for textiles. I don't know if it smells like barnyard or not. I haven't been able to verify that or get samples from them. But from like when I think about embodied carbon, and I think about what are the choices we're making right now on new buildings, because that's going to be the largest impact over the next 10 years, which seems like the critical zone to make it happen. And spray foam just seems like an obvious, like obviously there's no path for it to do anything but become microplastics in our sushi. And I don't see a good kind of mainstream alternative yet. I mean, there's cellulose.
I was going to ask that, if the kind of blown in cellulose insulation is a viable alternative, because
it is if it can be dense packed. That's I've seen some really good applications of cellulose and I've seen some really bad ones. So I think it comes down to the specific project team and kind of the oversight that's happening. But what a great product, right? I mean, it's cellulose.
It's a really important end market for low grade paper recycling.
Right.
A lot of that goes into that application and that process. So like newsprint, some of the other papers that don't have a super high value on their own is great for doing that cellulose insulation.
This is super fascinating. I see Catherine had a question if there is a regional eBay or eBay-like system for recycling building materials out there.
Yeah, that's kind of what we do actually. If you want to jump on austinmaterialsmarketplace.org or materialsmarketplace.org, wherever you want to land, we can get you plugged into our program, and we can see if there's something out there for you.
That's awesome. Lauren, we'll provide links in the chat.
Angela, I had
go ahead.
Mark, did you have one? Yeah. So I was just curious, Daniel, I don't know if you work with contractors. I guess I'm curious with some of those take back programs, like what are the hurdles there, pros, cons, like whose court does that usually lie in? Like, is it separate than the, general construction waste hauler for a project? What's the one of one, I guess, on that?
Yeah. I think what we've seen is a lot of that just kind of varies region to region. And I'm not super familiar with kind of that take back activity here in the Austin market. But you know, some of the bigger programs out there, like Armstrong Ceiling has a program to take back their acoustic tiles. We work with a company called Duralast. They're a roofing company in Michigan. They have a very robust take back program to bring back their, like, it's like a PVC weather barrier that you put down on a kind of a flat, low grade roof. And they have a great program. That's one of the kind of better examples, I think, of a company that's implemented something like that. But they bring all that material back, recycle it, I think 100%, and make it back into a vinyl flooring product that's not too shabby. You know, so there's definitely examples out there. I think yeah, if a company can do that at scale, yeah, and show that they can gather enough material to make it profitable, or, you know, at least break even on it. You know, I think those are the sorts of programs that are really going to drive a lot of impact in this space. And it's just the scale part is the tricky bit. You know, you have to be gathering truckload quantities of materials so the transportation makes sense and doesn't eat into all the environmental benefit. Yeah, and you have to have something that's going to sustain you know, another side of your business. But if it can be done, I think it's a really good way forward.
Have you seen any impacts over the past year, Daniel, with the amount of material that you've been able to harvest, I guess, or transfer through the marketplace?
Yeah. I think yeah, we've seen yeah, we've seen a good deal of impact. I think there's a lot of conversations that are kind of started right now that have been going on over 2020 that will really kick into gear too. We're kind of focused on a couple of different materials verticals right now. Plastics and the kind of challenging side of plastics, the films, and you know, some of the weirder materials is a big focus for us. Wood is a really big focus for us, looking more at some potential biomass opportunities there, coupled with carbon capture and storage. So you can do some really neat things in terms of overall, you know, negative carbon impact with that. Glass obviously is a really big focus for us, and I think we're going to be able to up those numbers even more than where they are now, which will be cool. So yeah, you know, it's a slow road. You know, business has been, I think, you know, slowly coming around to the concepts that we're working on and the things that we're working on. You know, but there's a long ways to go with it for sure.
I had a question, Daniel, for you.
Mhm.
You know, I have a bit of a background too in recycling, and
Yeah.
I'm just always curious about what are the barriers for openness and using trains for transportation of loads? You know, Balcones, they use it for transportation of glass. Do you hear about it more in other regions of the United States for logistics?
Yeah,
materials?
it's a very advantageous thing for companies that are moving a lot of materials to have access to that. But it's not super common for a lot of folks, unfortunately. And even if it is, you know, even if a company does have a rail spur in their backyard, figuring out how to actually make use of that is also a real challenge for folks. The tile manufacturer that I mentioned actually does have a you know, rail access in their backyard, but you know, I don't think they move any material with it. You know, so it's a tough one. But yeah, I'm trying to think if there's, yeah, there really, I don't think there's any examples in our network or transactions we've facilitated where materials are moving on rail car. I think it's all, you know, truckload quantities of material for the most part, if it's moving over a distance.
I had a quick question about kind of plastics recycling with regard to sort of this idea of perverse incentives that could be created. It just came to mind when thinking about plastic bags being utilized into decking, for example. Is that a conversation that happens at all in your experience, like within your organization, or you know, dealing with products that maybe could be better redesigned instead of incentivizing more and more production of a problematic product?
Yeah, nice loaded question there. I like it. It's yeah, it has to be a really important part of the conversation for sure. And you know, I love kind of seeing the new dialogue around eliminating single-use plastics, and there's definitely some slow movement in that direction from the corporates as well. You know, it is a very it's a double-edged sword in a lot of ways and in a lot of contexts. And if y'all haven't seen the recent Frontline doc that they did, Plastic Wars, go check that out and spend an hour watching that, because it goes into that subject in way more detail than I can probably explain. But yeah, but I think it's slowly starting to shift. Yeah, there's a really cool initiative that just launched, run by IDEO and a couple of big retailers. Beyond the Bag is the name of the initiative, but it's putting a lot of funding into redesigning the single-use plastic bag. Yeah, and I think the outcomes of that will be a lot of neat stuff in the bioplastics world, and a lot of kind of neat new ways of kind of designing this problem out. So, so companies are starting to focus on it, and I like that. Yeah, until then, there's a problem today that needs to be addressed. And that's probably mechanical recycling and markets like trucks that fill that gap. But long term, I think it's very clear that we need to move in a different direction, in a new direction.
Well, thank you, everyone, and thanks to our speakers for your great insights. I think it was a really thought-provoking and inspirational discussion today. Thanks to everyone who joined us. We're always happy to see familiar faces and new faces. Just wanted to let everyone know, remind everyone, we do have another event coming up next Thursday, which will be our second of our 4-part series on the AIA 2030 commitment. And Josh has been putting that together. And so we're really excited to be on the second of that series. So check that out. There's links online to sign up if you're interested. It's not too late. You didn't have to come to the first one if you missed it. You can still join us. Also, our meeting next month will be again on March 4th. And we'll be talking about sustainable buildings goals from the Climate Equity Plan related to refrigerants and water usage. So join us again next month for that. Are there any announcements that I'm missing, Kendall?
No, that's great.
So if you did miss the first of the 2030 series, there is a recording online. I believe you reached that through the COTE webpage on the AIA Austin website. Is that correct, Kendall or Ashley?
Yes, it should be a post at the bottom of our page on the AIA website.
Thanks, Josh. And speaking of websites and social media type things, we're trying to get some traction on our LinkedIn. So you can now find AIA Austin Committee on the Environment on LinkedIn. It's a group that you can join the group. So we'll be posting about upcoming events and meetings and such there. I think there's only a few of us who've joined the group now, and it doesn't have a lot of content, but we'll be developing that throughout the year. So please join if you have a LinkedIn, and feel free to share content to that group if you find articles or other things you want to share. And we'll kind of get that up and running this year.
Yeah, we might follow up from this event with some of the links that were shared today on LinkedIn so that you all have them somewhere.
I have a piece of good news if you want me to share that, Kendall.
Yes.
Always.
So for those of you who don't know, so we've kind of created this new structure where the outgoing chair of the Committee on the Environment functions in sort of a role that's focused on helping the new incoming chair kind of get trained, and also focused on advocacy generally, like who are we reaching out to, how are we doing it. And one of the things I've been focused on is the Texas Society of Architects. We have created a new sustainability task force. I know last year we had mentioned kind of a coalition that we had created with Dallas and Houston and San Antonio, and that's still going quite well and becoming a bit more official. And as of last week, we met with the committee chair for the Design Awards Committee at the Texas Society of Architects and our staff liaison there. And they are fully committed to using the Common application, the Common app, for their design awards. And if you're not familiar with what that means that the Texas Society of Architects has acknowledged the new framework for design excellence, which came from COTE National's work. And now, actual crunchy metrics will be of performance, both across the 10 measures of design excellence will be required to be reported on in order to submit a project for a design award. So that's really exciting. The state is actually outpacing our own local chapter. So that's kind of a fun dynamic, but I'll keep you posted as things develop. But we're going to be putting together some great trainings on how to use this very simple thing. And I'll be encouraging everybody here to attend that if you'd like, and let me know if you have any questions. Happy to get into more specifics.
Thanks, Miguel. All right, I think that's it. Thanks everyone so much for joining us and staying on for the extra 10 minutes. I feel like it was a really great conversation, and thanks Daniel and Shaun for your time and your presentations.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Stay in touch. Come to our next meeting.
Yeah, definitely.
All right, y'all. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Have a great weekend, everyone.
You too.
Come on. I pressed leave, but it's not leaving.